thank you to all of you for joining us today for this really important and timely conversation. While guests continue to join us for today's conversation with our experts that we're going to hear from, I want to take the opportunity to introduce myself. My name is David Foreman from Save the Children Australia, the Corporate Partnerships team, and again, great to have you here. Look, before we go any further, and as always, we want to acknowledge the many traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today across the country. I'm here in Geelong, Victoria, and so I'd like to pay my respects to the Wazarong people of the Kulin Nations, the traditional owners of the lands, and also acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are part of the greater Geelong community. A few things we'd like to let you know of today. We welcome your questions. You'll see at the bottom of your screen that we have a Q&A field there. Please do put through your questions and we'll endeavour to get to those in the back end of today's conversation. You are obviously on mute today and cameras are turned off, so obviously we can't see you, but appreciate you being here with us. As I mentioned before, we are recording today's session and we'll look to share that with you early next week. And then finally, just wanted to let you know that we've had a last minute change of speakers. Unfortunately, Vivek Bhatia from QBE couldn't join us today, but we are delighted to have one of QBE's executive team join us. We'll hear a little bit more about them shortly. Look, when we think back over the past 7 months, I think none of us could have predicted all that we've seen and experienced this year. You know, from the bushfires to COVID-19 to adjusting to a new way of living, to seeing the impacts on people's lives across the country, 2020 has prompted, responses and reactions in all of us that we may not have known was there. Look, in particular, these events have prompted an unprecedented response from corporate Australia in contributing to immediate relief and recovery efforts for crisis events of these natures. And, today what we want to do is to just stop and take the opportunity to have a conversation about that level of response, what that response from the private sector has looked like, what we can learn from it, and maybe what we could do differently in future. At this point in time, I'm going to ask our speakers to turn on their cameras and unmute themselves and have the opportunity to introduce them to you. So with us today, we have John Fox, Chief Claims Officer from QBE Australia Pacific, who's also co-chair of the QBE Foundation. And we also have Catherine Harris, Director of Southern Region from Save the Children Australia. Catherine, John, good to see you guys. How are you both doing today?
Thank you. Well, thanks, David. Good afternoon to you, and thanks very much for the opportunity to have a talk about these really important topics.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me, and it's good to be here.
Great. John, it looks like you're sitting in an office space there. For those of us in Victoria, I think we can't ever remember what the inside of an office looks like. How's the whole situation going for you guys there and entering back into the office?
Yeah, look, it's terrific here in Adelaide, South Australia. David, thank you. We absolutely feel for our colleagues and the communities in Victoria who are going through a pretty tough time, and also in some parts of New South Wales. From a whole of company perspective, we have mixed situations, but certainly in Adelaide, it's pretty good. Thank you.
Yeah, good to hear. And Catherine, I know you've had a busy and full house while working from home. I think you win the award for most people in the home while working. How's that experience gone for you?
Oh, look, it's been an interesting experience, David. We've got 7 people in the house, a whole lot of them working from home, and children with education experiences all over the place. So yes, it's been an interesting time, but it's led to some great connections with teams around Australia as we've all moved to this virtual world. So yeah,
good stuff. Good to hear you making the most of it. Look, let's turn our minds to the conversation for today and the topic for today. Look, Catherine, we'd love to start with you. Before we even talk about responses to national events, I want to begin with the idea of impact. Look, going beyond the headlines, we'd really love for you to tell us about the impact of the bushfires and now COVID-19 on communities, families, and individuals that you've been working with.
Sure, David. So I've got teams that have responded to both the bushfires and COVID-19 with vulnerable families in New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia. And I guess I'll just share a little bit what we've seen and what's happened to children during that time. So during the bushfires at the end of last year and the beginning of this year, we saw tens of thousands of children being impacted by the fires. In many cases in the communities that we were going into, this was off the back of drought. And then of course, COVID-19 followed on from that. So it's just a situation where you've got communities impacted by multiple trauma events. So during the bushfires, what we saw is children being evacuated from their homes, often multiple times. So they'd go home and then they'd be in danger again and they had to be evacuated again. And they were exposed to that real chaos of escape of the fires and then into the evacuation centres, which are quite a challenging place for adults, but they're absolutely really challenging for children, and often children's needs aren't understood or met in those evacuation centres. So if you don't address the needs of children in a crisis, you can see some really long-term effects on their ability to develop and grow. We also saw children, as they experienced losing their belongings, they saw animals dying, they saw their parents at their most vulnerable. And then when they went back into the communities that they came from, they'd lost, in some cases their homes, but in a lot of cases it was about them losing the spaces where they gathered, the parks and the playgrounds and in some cases schools, and they saw their friends being impacted. Again, if you don't manage that sort of impact well, the trauma can have lasting effects. I remember seeing this drawing from a little child from the Bairnsdale Evacuation Centre, and they'd done this drawing of a koala that was on a surfboard and the koala was burning. So this child had lost their home, but that wasn't what was worrying them most. It was the fact that the animals were being affected and they just didn't know what was going to happen to the animals. So you really, you need to understand things from a child's perspective as well as the family's perspective during these crises. There's been some research done actually since the Black Saturday fires by a group of academics at Melbourne University led by Lisa Gibbs. And what they looked at was the long-term effects on children into adulthood of existing within a bushfire-affected community. And it was found that if you don't address the trauma, then children's mental health and their well-being and their ability to engage in school just is so impacted, and that then it reverberates through to adulthood. So we're seeing that now in communities 6 months down the track after the fires, where we've got kids that are really finding it hard to manage their learning because they haven't dealt with the impact of what's going on in their lives. We're just going into a school actually down in East Gippsland next week where they've stopped the whole school curriculum because the teachers have said after the bushfires, then COVID, we've got children that cannot engage in learning. So we've got to address all of these issues for them before we move on. So, this is some of the experiences that's happening out there post just the bushfires, and that again, we'll see more of that due to COVID.
Thanks, Catherine. You painted such a vivid picture there of what it looks like. For a lot of us, that's only a handful of hours down the road from where a lot of us live around the country and have gone through these types of experiences. John, with that in mind and seeing how that's just touched people's lives so directly, we'd love to hear from you as to QBE's response efforts to the crisis events again of bushfires and COVID-19, and really interested to hear from you at both the core business level, but then also from that sort of community investment foundation led activity that you've been involved with there as well.
Absolutely, David. Thanks for the opportunity. Look, as a major corporate in this region, the Asia Pacific region, we at QBE take the health and wellbeing of our customers, partners, community and employees as a #1 priority, particularly in difficult times like these. When the bushfires hit, we took a number of immediate steps to respond to our customers' needs. We offered emergency assistance payments to those that needed it and temporary accommodation. We set up temporary offices so people had somewhere they could go to talk to somebody about what was going to happen to help them in the recovery. For the first time ever, we took an opportunity to waive excess payments so that enabled people to have some additional financial assistance. We know it's not just about property loss and about financial pressure though. We know it's about mental health and wellbeing. So we've extended our employee wellbeing program to our customers, irrespective of whether they were making a claim in those impacted areas. We also provided a $500,000 donation to support Black Summer bushfire relief and recovery efforts, with $250,000 of that being directed to Save the Children's work establishing child-friendly spaces within evacuation and recovery centres for communities affected by the fires. This funding has also contributed to the delivery of a long-term recovery program. In respect to COVID-19, another difficult and challenging situation that we needed to respond to. As it continues to develop, we want our customers to feel supported, particularly those who are facing increased financial stress. We've sent out gift cards to all private motor customers who have a policy with us to try and relieve some of the pressure on household budgets. We've developed support for our SME business customers as well, and that's in the area of continuing to provide insurance for vacant premises and also deferred premium payments. There's a huge body of work going on to address the needs of vulnerable customers as well, those experiencing financial difficulty, which has been ramped up in the face of COVID-19 within our organisation. Some of the relief we currently offer includes extending payment timeframes and policy changes in certain circumstances, and also along with deferring excess payments for up to 6 months. In our efforts to continually support communities in which we operate, the QBE Foundation has directed 2.6 million Australian dollars globally to support our charity partners in response to the COVID-19 crisis. This includes utilising the global disaster relief funds with over $1 million directed to Save the Children and Red Cross for COVID-19 response and recovery efforts, not only in Australia and Pacific, but in other international areas of need as well.
Thanks, John. That's really helpful. I mean, it's certainly a diversified approach in terms of how you're going about that. And often we, see news articles, and when I think back to some, seeing all those companies in Australia that we're giving very generously, and we sort of see companies' names and amounts of money, but we're not quite clear on what it is that they're doing. I think you've really broken that down for us. There's a question that came through just saying that this is so heartbreaking. How can corporate Australia help? And I think you've answered some of that. Catherine, from your perspective, can you tell us a bit about Save the Children's response efforts? I mean, you've touched on that a little bit already, but also some of the companies that you and your team have been working with to sort of deliver their response efforts.
Sure, David. So at the time of the bushfires and post most disasters that we are involved with around the world and in Australia, Save the Children will go in and will set up child-friendly spaces in evacuation and recovery centres. So what these are quite a deliberate model for Save the Children. They're safe spaces where children can come out of the chaos of the disaster and the recovery centre, and they can get some support in the form of psychological first aid, material support. They just find a place to play and to process their experiences and to be a child. So I think we started our first child-friendly space in October last year, and we exited the last one at the end of March. So, the beginning of mid-March, basically. So we were at it for a little while. So post that sort of immediate evacuation centre, we'll go back out into community with people, and we run pop-up child-friendly spaces. So I said to you, one of the big impacts that we heard from children during the bushfires was that when they went back into their community, all their play spaces had gone. All the spaces where they went to gather and play together and experience support had gone. So we run pop-up child-friendly spaces out in the communities, and we went to some far-flung spots and did some amazing things. And I remember a story of the child-friendly space that we set up in Buchan down in Victoria, where a mum was with her child in the child-friendly space, and she looked up and said to one of my team, I just forgot that the kids have to play. In all of this chaos, I forgot how important it is that they play and that they can actually be children, and that's what the child-friendly spaces allow. We then stick around. So our recovery program, which is called Journey of Hope, it allows us to work with children to manage their mental health and their emotions once the disaster's over. So the program runs for 8 weeks, and we run it in schools with the kids. And we're deep into delivering Journey of Hope at the moment. We provide also other services based on what community needs. We all around Australia, we've provided education packs and some resource packs into communities where families and children went into lockdown for COVID-19, and we provide additional family support just to make sure that someone's got an eye on children in very vulnerable circumstances. So that's really important that we do that we respond to the needs of the community. Look, we had significant support from corporate Australia and beyond, actually, from overseas organisations as well, to help us provide these emergency responses and recovery. And John, I just want to paint a picture for you about how fantastic it was to know that we had your funds, and we also got funds from Lego Australia to deliver those child-friendly spaces. It was the worst experience getting the phone call. Can you deploy? Can you send a team out? We've got kids everywhere. We just don't know what to do. And knowing that we had funds to be able to send the team out and have the resources to run those child-friendly spaces was absolutely incredible. We could actually concentrate on the children. So yeah, QBE contributed $250,000 to the bushfire response, and then more again to the COVID response across Australia and the Pacific and Europe and Hong Kong. So that's been fantastic. Lego contributed $1.4 million to fund the child-friendly spaces, and then that Journey of Hope program where we're still in communities supporting them. VTech, for example, provided a whole lot of education learning toys that we've distributed to families impacted by COVID-19. And this just makes sure that kids can continue to learn in that challenging environment of lockdown. We had Sukin, I remember when this came, it was amazing, contributed $330,000 worth of hand sanitizer, and my teams were just trying to buy hand sanitizer and just couldn't find it. So that was just such a welcome, gift in kind. Fantastic. And DHL provided logistics and freight forwarding services. So that sounds very unsexy, but you have no idea how difficult it is when we've got all of these donations and support that our families actually need. And we've just got to get it out to communities, and they really helped with that. So that's just some of the example of the support that we got from corporate Australia, not only immediately, but into the recovery phase.
Yeah, that's great. That's really helpful. And again, I think for those on the line and those who've joined to get a sense of what can be done, I think you've pointed to that really well. So thanks, Catherine. John, we're 6 months on from the height of the bushfire season. Remember seeing the news stories and the articles. We're 6 months on from the first confirmed case of COVID-19 in Australia. You spoke about some of your response efforts at QBE, which has been helpful for us to understand. I guess the question, to you there is, how effective do you think the QBE has been in that response that you put forward? It's a diversified response across multi-markets. How effective has that response been from your perspective? And then, and what have you sort of been measuring yourself against to be able to sort of make that judgment call?
Yeah, great, David. Thank you. Look, it's really interesting. Whilst we never want to see natural disasters like we did in the Black Summer event, and also more recently the disaster with COVID-19, but it's interesting, we launched our global disaster relief and resilience partnerships with Save the Children and Red Cross on Friday the 8th of November, and that following weekend immediately after that, the bushfires started to ramp up. So it meant that we were in a position to really quickly activate those new partnerships. The timing of the launch of our partnerships really couldn't have been timed better, as it meant that the structure and the process had been planned by our three organisations months before it could be put into operation immediately. Also, in relation to the partnership, a key part of that is the ability to be flexible and reactive with funds, not only to fund responses to disasters, but also the long road to recovery for communities and making sure we can help them to be more resilient in the future, as Catherine alluded to. For example, not only were we able to make immediate support to Save the Children for the friendly spaces that we've talked about in the 9 evacuation centres during the fires, we funded the long-term recovery program, Journey of Hope, which Catherine also mentioned, which responds to the long-term needs of communities long after the disaster response phase has passed, to help them recover from the trauma and get the support they need.
Yeah, that's really great to hear. Thanks for that, John. Look, Catherine, we've had a focus on QBE, we've had a focus on Save the Children. If we cast our minds a little bit more broadly, would be interested to hear your perspective on overall how effective you think corporate Australia has been in responding to these crisis events, and do you think there's any lessons from that will shape how corporate Australia responds in future?
Yeah, good question, David. Look, I think the immediate response was significant and it was timely. Many companies didn't hesitate in contributing. Without, like, as I said, without the funding from QBE and Lego, we couldn't have got into the evacuation and recovery centres, which is a really important part of ensuring that children are safe. So, and lots of organisations did that. They responded quickly. And also with gift in kind, when we reached out for COVID and sort of asked for gift in kind, that was also significant. And it kind of helped us to hold families while we were finding another way to deliver services to them. So we couldn't, in COVID-19, when that started, we couldn't deliver face-to-face, and we had to change the whole way that we did service delivery. And while we were doing that, having those donations and being able to distribute them really helped us keep connected to families and respond to their immediate needs. So again, I think there's that immediate crisis response, which seems to be really great in corporate Australia. You don't see a lot of commitment to long-term recovery in corporate Australia. And I think that that's a really big opportunity. I think I said before, we're hearing from those communities that they feel really abandoned. And I think it's really important that we keep on supporting some of these communities because, they're corporate Australia's customers. And if we don't look after the children and families in those communities, it will just reverberate throughout the whole economy. So I think that's a learning for corporate Australia. The capacity to have funds quickly available. John talked about QBE being able to respond. That made such a difference, as I've said. So supporting in that way, where you enable organisations like Save the Children and Red Cross to be able to deploy as soon as a crisis happens, and then just sticking around for the long term. I think that's where the opportunity lies.
Yeah, thanks. Really good point you make there about that recovery. Let's come back to that in a moment. I think you've sort of flagged something really important there. But John, in terms of lessons learned from QBE, again, you guys were quick off the mark. You were there, ready to roll. Again, looking back at it on this side, from not only this experience, but other, crisis events you've responded to over the years, what are some of the lessons that you guys are taking from this?
Look, unfortunately, we have had a long history in responding to natural disasters, and each time the circumstances are different, but the response, the need to respond immediately, quickly, and to identify people's needs is the same. And so we continue to learn, test, innovate to make ourselves stronger each time we respond to these types of events. We recognise that whilst we're ensuring individuals in these communities and these locations, it's the whole community that suffers and has needs as well. So, this is really why the Global Disaster Relief and Resilience Partnerships made so much sense for us, because We do have that responsibility to our individual customers, but we really want to play a broader role in the communities and helping them to get back on their feet and indeed build resilience and mitigation for future events. One of the things that we've done more recently is we've identified the need to quickly understand the magnitude of the impact to our customer base so that we can put things in place to respond to them immediately. So we've developed an industry-first customer mapping tool that enables us to quickly identify customer segments that are likely to be impacted by the particular event or natural disaster. And that enables us to very, very quickly identify and make contact with those customers to prioritise customers that may be more vulnerable than others so that we can respond very quickly to them and to now work with our partners, Save the Children and Red Cross, in making sure that we deliver to our customers and the communities things that are really important depending on the disaster and the situation.
Thanks, John. Appreciate that. Look, Catherine, want to go back to the point you made about recovery. And, you know, again, when we sort of think of things like press releases and stories that we read, usually it's that kind of, you know, immediate response and pictures of people being there in the trenches when it's needed most. And obviously that is such critical importance. But can you just unpack for us a little bit more about the value of investing in long-term recovery? I mean, what does that mean? What does that do for communities in the long run?
Yes, the long-term recovery stuff is not quite as sexy to corporate Australia as the immediate emergency response. It's that real long-haul stuff, David, where it's hard and it needs a fair bit of commitment, and you often can't see it because people have returned to their day-to-day lives. But as I've reflected in that research that's been done, where you have people's mental health and well-being being impacted and people's capacity to have resilience to life, if you don't address that, it reverberates more deeply. So we've got to respond to the emergency, but we've got to stick with these communities. We've got to make sure that they have a voice in what they need. That's really important. There's a bit of a tendency, and we've heard this so much from these bushfire affected communities, there's a bit of a tendency for people to waltz into town and say, we know what you need, but it's really important to listen to what those communities need and respond to those. And for Save the Children, it's really around ensuring that children's voices are heard, because they are going to carry the long-term impact, and they are the ones that are often overlooked in emergencies and in recovery response. So genuinely listening to the voices of children and allowing children to be able to express what they need to manage their own recovery and build resilience is really important. So we've got programs like Journey of Hope, and we've got the Child Voice program that we're doing out in these bushfire affected communities, where we're going and helping the communities to actually listen appropriately to children and fold their feedback into disaster planning, which is absolutely essential. If we don't get this right, we're just going to see really significant long-term impacts on communities that just have not been able to recover. So I would challenge corporate Australia to not just think about the immediate response, and that, you know, we love doing that too. We feel really useful doing that too, but it's that really long-term stuff that we've got to keep at. They say it's between 3 and 5 years to recover from something like bushfires. So yeah, I would just encourage corporate Australia to be involved and contribute.
Yeah, thanks. Look, I think you're sort of pushing into some ideas around sort of, you know, building resilience in communities and again, a sense of a long term. I want to come back to you on a follow-up question. Look, just to the audience, we're going to open it up for a Q&A really shortly. So please, if you have any questions, put them through. We'd love to be able to field those as they come through. So again, be thinking if anything's been stirring in your mind over, you know, the past few minutes while we've been talking, or you came into this with a question you might want to ask, please do put through that and we'll take a look in the Q&A. Look, Catherine, just talking, you know, what you're speaking about there, about that idea of, you know, building preparedness and resilience in communities for the long term. again, are there any sort of, what are the sorts of initiatives that companies can be investing in, really today to be future-proofing communities tomorrow? Is there any other sort of examples that you might provide for us around the what question? I'm thinking of that question that came over our Q&A before. It's like, what can we do? What can companies invest in?
So I think it's really important to invest in programs that build the capacity of organisations like Red Cross and importantly Save the Children to be able to respond quickly when the crisis is happening. So we've got programs in Save the Children, like our child-friendly spaces, which allow us to really resolve the issues. But we've got to be able to galvanise quickly, so that we've got to know that we've got the funds and the capacity to be able to do that. So investing in things that allow immediate response from organisations that know what to do in these situations is really important. Look, there's a number of initiatives that provide mental health and wellbeing support to children and families and communities in disaster. That is absolutely critical. As I've said multiple times, if we can build people's resilience, if we can address their mental health issues, if we can give them the capacity to be able to recover, then the impact long term is going to be less. So our Journey of Hope program, for example, that I've been speaking about, we're funded to deliver to 5,000 children in bushfire affected communities. We are absolutely chewing through that and the demand is just significant. So supporting programs like that, it builds resilience in communities. Look, there's also a number of place-based initiatives. So I've talked about this need for communities to be able to manage their own recovery and express their own needs. So where you've got initiatives which allow the community to come together, define the issues, design a response and go about responding to the issue, they're really important during recovery. So we run, for example, a program in East Gippsland called the Children's Wellbeing Initiative. We've got 80 organisations that come together and they agree on how we're going to support children and young people through our combined effort. So instead of everybody running off doing their own thing, we've got everybody working together in that community for children and young people. So in response to COVID, for example, these organisations which we help manage, they pooled all their resources and created all of these packs and resources for children and families and distributed them and made sure that support was wrapped around all of the families because they were experiencing that post-bushfires, post-COVID response. So our place-based initiative, Children's Wellbeing Initiative, is going to be so important in these communities over the next 3 years. Government's still getting their head around funding these types of programs. So in the interim, until they do, and I'm sure they will, there's rising understanding that community response is really important. But until that happens, we need support from corporate Australia and philanthropy, as well as people within that community. So they're the types of things that people can get involved with.
Yeah, that's really helpful there. Thanks for giving us that understanding. John, want to ask you a similar question around that sense of building resilience in communities, for the long term, protecting communities, or building resilience today to protect against shocks of tomorrow. What's just very quickly, could you tell us what QBE is doing in that space?
Yeah, absolutely, David. So look, as an insurer, one of our key responsibilities is to help people to put their lives back together after a catastrophe, and that really focuses in our expertise on things like rebuilding homes, rebuilding businesses so they can operate in the communities, and helping people to get that physical asset back in shape. But clearly, as we've talked about and Catherine so eloquently has described for us, there's that really strong emotional need as well. And we like to think that our partnership with Save the Children and Red Cross is how we contribute to building that resilience and responding to that emotional need, whilst at the same time working on that key cornerstone of expertise that we already have in the physical sense. And we do that through grants and donations, and enabling organisations like Save the Children to do what they do best, and to put the things in place that respond best to those social and more emotional needs. So from our perspective, supporting things like building disaster-proof homes in Fiji, contributing to organisations that are doing that, and also building more resilience in communities that have poverty, poor nutrition, pre-existing health conditions, and doing that mostly through financial contribution.
Great, great. John, we've had a question come in from the audience, and I'll pose this one to you. It says, what does corporate Australia look for when deciding to partner with and support charities? And I guess the flip of that is, what should corporate Australia look for was in the question there.
Yeah, it's a great question. My view is that we should look for partnering with organisations that make sense to what we're about and where we think we can make the biggest difference. One of the great things about Save the Children and Red Cross is that their distribution very much matches our global distribution as well. So we feel that it's a good match from that perspective. We can have great reach to communities around the world, but also we believe that there's a natural link to the work that we do from a physical recovery perspective with the emotional recovery perspective as well. And I think it's really key, first and foremost, that the organisations you wish to support and you choose have some sort of link to what you're about.
Yeah, great. Look, one more question, and then we'll wrap it up for the day. Question to both of you. We'll put this on to the both of you. You know, I wanted to get your thoughts on the idea of a coordinated response. And to take an example of that, you know, if we look at the Business Council of Australia, they've got their Biz Rebuild initiative, you know, where multiple companies are pulling funds together to respond to what's going on to the bushfire impacts in communities there. I'd love to get your thoughts just very quickly. Is that helpful? Catherine, does that help or hinder the work of organisations like Save the Children? John, does that help or hinder the objectives that you're trying to meet in the communities that you're serving?
Perhaps, Catherine, if you'd like me to make a comment first, and then I'll certainly hand to you. Look, it's the same old adage of more heads are better than one, David. Take the partnership between Save the Children, Red Cross and QBE, and look what we've been able to come up with and do as a meaningful response in a number of situations. I would argue that that's come about by using three great organisations with good intent.
Catherine?
Look, I think it is a great initiative. If I think about the effort that goes in to chase down what we need with respect to things like gift in kind, or even knowing where funding is to be able to respond in the case of a disaster, it would be fantastic if we could have a coordinated response to that. And I also think it really helps from an advocacy perspective. If you have business speaking with one voice, you have community organisations, and you have government together, and we have the right response based on evidence, I just wonder how many lives we could save, how much better could our communities be, how much more resilient they could be in the case of disaster, how much quicker could we respond if we all put our heads together. It's good for everyone, for the community, for business and for government, and I'd really encourage it.
Brilliant. Well, John, Catherine, thank you so much for your time today. Yeah, that's been a really helpful conversation. You know, I think for those on the line, you know, I think we'll all take away some sort of practical insights as to what we can do better, how can we respond in these sorts of scenarios. So thanks for just helping us go a little bit below the surface there and unpack that. That's been fantastic there. I want to thank the audience for joining us today. Really good to have you on board for the conversation there. Thanks for those questions that came through. Look, from today's conversation, if you'd like to connect with Save the Children and hear how we're partnering with companies both in Australia and around the world, we'd love to hear from you. You can get in contact with us via the following email address: partnerships@savethechildren.org.au. That's partnerships@savethechildren.org.au. Hey, and even if you've got any questions for QBE around their approach, sing out to us. We can get in contact and share some of their learnings there. I'm sure they'll be happy to do so. Again, thanks for joining us. Hope to see you on our next virtual event. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.